Jason Statham pulled the brim of his black cap lower over his face, stepping out of his matte black SUV onto the pavement. A crisp breeze swept through the city streets, carrying with it the scent of fresh bread and grilled steak from the high-end restaurant just ahead, his restaurant. It wasn't often that he walked into his own establishments unnoticed, but tonight he wanted to see things from the ground level, the way an ordinary customer would. No VIP treatment, no name recognition. Just a man looking for a meal. Dressed in a simple hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, he kept his head down as he stepped through the sleek glass doors. The restaurant was just as elegant as he remembered. Warm lighting, polished mahogany tables, and a golden chandelier casting soft glows across the deep red walls. Yet, something felt off. Jason had been in enough dangerous situations to recognize tension when he saw it. The air inside wasn't filled with the usual lively chatter of satisfied customers. Instead, conversations were hushed. Staff moved with stiff, nervous precision. There was no easy laughter, no light-hearted banter between the waiters. Jason took a slow step forward, scanning the room. A waiter passed by carrying a tray, but his grip on the glass stem was white-knuckled. A young hostess stood by the entrance, plastering on a fake smile for a couple that just walked in. But the moment they passed, her expression dropped, like someone carrying a weight too heavy to bear. His instincts kicked in. Years of navigating high-pressure situations, from movie sets to real-life encounters, told him this wasn't just an off night. And then he heard it, a soft sobbing. Jason froze. The sound came from the back of the restaurant, past the dimly lit booths in the bar area. It was faint, almost drowned out by the ambient jazz playing through the speakers. But it was there. Raw, broken, filled with pain. He turned his head slightly, following the sound. A few customers had noticed it too, their brows furrowed in mild curiosity. But no one moved. No one did anything. Jason clenched his jaw. Keeping his pace steady, he strode toward the source of the sound. As he got closer, the sobs became clearer. Shaky breaths, quiet gasps between muffled cries. He rounded the corner near the kitchen entrance, stepping into the dimly lit hallway where staff usually took their breaks. And that's when he saw her. A young black waitress, sitting on the cold tile floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Her uniform, a neatly pressed white shirt and black apron, was slightly crumpled, her hands trembling as she wiped at the tears staining her cheeks. Jason's stomach tightened. She looked defeated, not just upset, but completely broken, like she had held back too much for too long, and now the dam had burst. His eyes flicked to the side. A door to the kitchen stood slightly ajar, and through the gap he caught sight of something that made his blood boil. Two other waiters stood inside, their faces pale, eyes cast downward. Across from them, a man in a tailored navy suit leaned casually against the counter, arms crossed. He had a smirk on his face, the kind that made Jason's fists itch. Even from here, Jason didn't need to hear the full conversation to know what had happened. The girl sobbing on the floor wasn't just upset. She had been humiliated. Jason inhaled slowly, forcing down the anger rising in his chest. He had come here undercover to observe, but suddenly he wasn't sure if he could just watch anymore. Jason crouched down slowly, his movements careful, controlled. He had spent years perfecting his ability to assess a situation without escalating it. Right now, this girl, this waitress, was drowning in something deep, and Jason needed to understand what had pushed her over the edge. "Hey," his voice was low, steady. "You all right?" The girl flinched at first, her tear-streaked face lifting slightly. Her brown eyes, wide and filled with distress, flicked up to his, then quickly away as if she was afraid to even acknowledge someone had noticed her pain. Jason wasn't the type to push, but silence wasn't an option either. "You work here?" he asked, already knowing the answer. She nodded hesitantly, sniffing as she wiped her sleeve across her face. Yeah." Her voice was barely a whisper. Jason exhaled through his nose, glancing back toward the kitchen, where that smug-looking man still leaned against the counter. His gut told him that whoever he was, he had something to do with this. "What happened?" Jason pressed gently. The girl hesitated before her lips trembled, and she lowered her head again. "It doesn't matter," she muttered, voice hollow. "It won't change anything." That hit Jason harder than he expected. Defeat, that's what he heard in her voice. But he wasn't about to let it go. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated for a moment before whispering, "Aaliyah." Jason nodded, locking that name in his memory. Aaliyah, a young woman with ambition stuck in a place that had clearly crushed her spirit. Before he could say another word, a voice cut through the hallway like a knife. "You done with your little meltdown?" Aaliyah's whole body tensed. Jason's jaw clenched. He turned his head to see Victor. Tall, lean, and dressed in an expensive tailored navy suit, the man oozed arrogance. His slicked-back dark hair and sharp, angular features only added to the smug expression permanently etched onto his face. The slight smirk on his lips told Jason everything he needed to know. He enjoyed this. Victor didn't look at Jason. He didn't even acknowledge him. His entire focus was on Aaliyah, who had shrunk into herself, hands clenched into fists on her lap. "Get up," Victor ordered, voice dripping with condescension. "You're embarrassing yourself, and me." Jason's fingers twitched. The way he spoke to her, the sheer entitlement in his tone, the power play, it made Jason's blood boil. Aaliyah took a shaky breath and moved as if to stand, but Jason lifted a hand subtly, stopping her. "Not yet." He turned his attention to Victor. "That how you talk to your staff?" Only then did Victor's eyes flick over to him, brows raising as if he was only now noticing Jason's presence. His lips curled in mild amusement. "And you are?" Jason could have easily revealed himself right then and there, told this entitled prick exactly who he was speaking to, but that would have ruined the point of coming here undercover. "Just a customer," Jason replied, voice calm. "One who doesn't particularly like seeing employees get treated like garbage." Victor let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "You have no idea what you're talking about, mate." He crossed his arms, glancing down at Aaliyah like she was nothing more than a nuisance. "This one's just dramatic. She's lucky she even has a job." Jason's muscles coiled tight. "Lucky?" Aaliyah sucked in a breath, blinking rapidly, clearly trying to stop fresh tears from falling. Jason leveled Victor with a look. "That right?" His tone was dangerously low now. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like she's terrified of you." Victor's smirk widened. "That's called discipline, something these kids don't understand anymore. They whine, they cry, they pull the race card." Jason's fists clenched at his sides. The race card. There it was, the disgusting casual racism that men like Victor used to justify their power trips. "She's been working here for months," Victor continued. "She should be grateful I keep her around. Customers don't exactly like attitude, and she's got plenty." Jason's gaze flicked to Aaliyah, who kept her eyes firmly on the floor, too scared to even defend herself. Victor sighed dramatically. "Look, I don't have time for this. Aaliyah, you can either get back to work or walk out that door and never come back. Your choice." Aaliyah stiffened. Jason saw the war in her eyes, the sheer weight of the no-win situation Victor had just forced on her. She needed this job, but every second she stayed, she was being ground further into the dirt. And Jason? Jason had seen enough. "She's not going anywhere," Jason said, voice like steel. Victor scoffed. "Excuse me?" Jason straightened up, stepping slightly between Aaliyah and the so-called manager. "You heard me." Victor's amusement faltered for the first time, irritation flashing in his eyes. "I don't know who you think you are, but I run this restaurant, and the staff here knows better than to go against me." Jason studied him, piecing things together. That explained why no one else had stepped in. The fear in the employees' eyes, the stiff, nervous energy in the air. Victor had them all under his thumb. "You got them scared, don't you?" Jason murmured, eyes locked onto Victor's. "That's how you keep them quiet." Victor smirked again, but this time it was colder. "You have no idea who you're messing with, mate." Jason tilted his head. Yeah? And you have no idea who you just threatened. Victor's eyes narrowed. I don't care who you are. Jason let a slow, knowing smirk cross his own lips. You will. For the first time, Victor hesitated. Aaliyah, still seated on the floor, looked up at Jason with something different in her eyes. Hope. Because maybe, just maybe, someone was finally standing up for her. Jason settled back into his seat at the restaurant, eyes locked onto Victor as the smug manager strutted around like he owned the place, which technically he did. The air inside the restaurant was thick with tension. The staff moved stiffly, their eyes darting around, avoiding Victor's gaze. It was clear that fear was the unspoken rule here. No one wanted to be the next target. Jason's jaw clenched as he watched Victor approach Aaliyah, who was carefully balancing a tray of drinks. Oi! Victor's voice rang through the restaurant, loud enough for everyone to hear. Aaliyah flinched. Jason's fingers curled into a fist. He already knew this wasn't going to end well. The entire restaurant seemed to freeze as Victor stormed up to Aaliyah, his face twisted in a look of exaggerated disgust. Jason had seen this before. This wasn't about a mistake, it was about power, control, and humiliation. You call this service? Victor sneered, snatching the tray from her hands. The sudden motion caused one of the glasses to wobble, spilling water onto the edge of a customer's table. Aaliyah gasped, immediately reaching for napkins, her face pale with panic. I'm so sorry. Victor didn't let her finish. You're sorry? His voice dripped with mockery. Sorry doesn't fix incompetence. Jason's grip on his glass tightened. This was personal. Victor was enjoying this. The customers around them awkwardly glanced away, uncomfortable but unwilling to interfere. Some whispered to each other, but no one spoke up. You think I pay you to be useless? Victor continued, shaking his head like Aaliyah was a lost cause. Because from where I'm standing, you're just dead weight. Aaliyah's breath came in quick, uneven bursts. Jason could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled at her sides. Victor turned to the nearby customers, forcing a fake smile. I do apologize, folks. Some people just don't understand standards. A few customers gave awkward chuckles, while others looked away, uncomfortable. Jason's blood boiled. Sir, please. Aaliyah tried to speak, but Victor cut her off with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. You know what? Victor said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm done wasting my time. You're fired. Silence. Aaliyah's body went rigid. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She blinked, as if her brain was struggling to process what had just been said. What? You heard me. Victor smirked, crossing his arms. Pack your things and get out. Jason inhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay seated. Not yet. Aaliyah's face crumpled. Please, you need this job. Victor scoffed. And I need competent employees. Clearly, we're both out of luck. Jason saw it then, the moment Aaliyah broke. She wasn't just humiliated. She was desperate. Her hands clenched at her apron. Please. My mom, she's sick. I'm the only one taking care of her. To need this job to pay for her medication. For a brief second, just a fraction of a moment, Jason thought maybe, just maybe, Victor would show a sliver of humanity. Instead, Victor laughed. A short, cruel chuckle that cut through the air like a blade. Not my problem, he said, shaking his head. Maybe if you spent less time crying and more time doing your job, you wouldn't be in this position. Jason felt his patience snap like a dry twig. His chair scraped against the floor as he stood, slow and deliberate. The sound echoed through the silent restaurant, drawing every eye toward him. Victor turned, frowning. And what do you think you're doing? Jason locked eyes with him, and for the first time, Victor saw the storm brewing beneath the surface. Say that again, Jason said, voice low and dangerous. Victor's smirk returned. Oh, don't tell me you're one of those bleeding hearts who gets worked up over a bit of discipline. Jason took a step forward. Firing someone over a spilled drink isn't discipline. It's a power trip. Victor's jaw tightened. but his smugness didn't falter. This is my restaurant. My rules. Jason tilted his head. That right? Victor crossed his arms. Yeah, and I don't recall asking for your opinion, mate. Jason exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. This wasn't the time. But Aaliyah, she had nothing left to lose. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she turned to Victor one last time, her voice shaking. I've given everything to this job. I work overtime. I take extra shifts. I do everything you ask. Victor gave her a slow, mocking clap. And yet, here we are, still useless. Aaliyah's breath hitched, her shoulders shaking as she struggled to hold herself together. Jason saw the other employees watching, silent, afraid. Not one of them stepped in. And Jason knew why. They couldn't. Because Victor had made it clear. Speak up, and you're next. Aaliyah wiped her tears roughly, shoulders stiffening as she turned away. She had no fight left. Jason clenched his jaw. Victor smirked, watching her like a predator who had just won. Jason's fingers twitched. The urge to put this man in his place burned in his veins. But he knew better than to lash out in front of an audience. No, there was a better way to take Victor down. For now, Jason exhaled slowly and took a step back. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jason exhaled slowly, forcing his fist to relax at his sides. Not yet. Victor stood there, smirking like he had just won some twisted game. The restaurant was still painfully silent, every staff member pretending they hadn't seen what had just happened. The customers were no better. Some awkwardly sipped their drinks, others glanced at their phones, doing anything to avoid eye contact. Jason slid his hands into his pockets, schooling his expression into one of casual curiosity. If Victor thought this was over, he was dead wrong. He took a step forward, tilting his head. Bit harsh, don't you think? Victor turned, eyes narrowing. Excuse me? Jason shrugged, keeping his voice light. I mean, she made a mistake, sure. But firing someone over spilled water? He chuckled like he was just a bystander making an observation. That's a bit extreme, mate. Victor scoffed, crossing his arms. You got a problem with how I run my business? Jason smirked. Just seems like bad management, that's all. You fire someone over something small, and now you're short-staffed. Who's covering her tables? Victor's expression flickered, but he recovered quickly. I don't expect some random customer to understand how a high-end restaurant operates. Jason raised an eyebrow. High-end, huh? He gestured to the other staff, their stiff movements, the way they avoided eye contact. They don't look too happy to be here. Victor's smirk twitched. They know their place. Jason's stomach turned at those words. He had heard men like Victor say those things before. They never saw employees as people, just tools to use and discard. Jason kept his smile, pretending to let it go. Fair enough, he said, stepping back. Guess you do things differently here, Victor scoffed. Exactly. Now, if you're done wasting my time... Aaliyah suddenly stepped forward. Her eyes were still red from crying, but there was something else in them now, a flicker of defiance. Thank you, she whispered to Jason. Jason met her gaze, seeing the weight she carried. She had nothing left, but she still had her pride. Victor rolled his eyes. Oh, spare me the dramatics. You're still fired. Aaliyah flinched but nodded, swallowing hard. She turned to leave, shoulders slumped. Jason couldn't let this end here. He took a slow breath, his mind already working. He needed proof. He needed evidence that showed who Victor really was. Jason reached into his pocket and tapped his phone, discreetly starting a voice recording. If Victor was really as arrogant as he seemed, it wouldn't take much to make him talk. He leaned casually against the counter, watching as Victor barked orders at the remaining staff. This guy loved the sound of his own voice. Jason just had to give him the right push. Must be nice, Jason said, keeping his tone light. Victor barely looked at him. What? Having all this power, Jason continued, waving a hand around the restaurant. You snap your fingers and people listen. Must feel good. Victor turned fully, his smugness returning. You wouldn't understand. Jason smirked. Try me. Victor chuckled, shaking his head. You think running a place like this is easy? People like Aaliyah don't get it. They think hard work is enough, but that's not how the world works. Jason raised an eyebrow. Oh, Victor leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. This business isn't about hard work. It's about knowing the right people, connections. He smirked. That's why I can do whatever I want, fire whoever I want. Jason's jaw clenched, but he kept his expression neutral. You think anyone here will challenge me? Victor laughed. Please, they need their jobs too much. They're all replaceable. Jason forced a chuckle. Cold but effective. Victor grinned. Exactly. People complain about fairness, but this isn't about fair. It's about control. And as long as I have that, no one can touch me. Jason's phone was still recording, every arrogant word being saved. Got you. Jason nodded, pretending to be impressed. Smart. Victor patted his chest. That's why I'm in charge. Jason's smile was razor sharp. Yeah, we'll see about that. Just then, Aaliyah reappeared at the doorway, clutching a small bag with her belongings. Her eyes met Jason's, uncertain but grateful. Jason gave her the slightest nod. She wasn't alone in this fight. He turned back to Victor, still grinning like he was untouchable. Jason exhaled slowly. Not for long. Jason took a slow, measured step forward, his eyes locked on Victor. The smug manager still had that arrogant smirk, completely unaware of the storm about to hit him. Jason exhaled, his voice calm but firm. You're fired. Victor blinked. Then he threw his head back and laughed. Oh, that's rich. Fired? You must be joking. Jason's expression didn't change. Not a joke. Victor scoffed. And who the hell do you think you are? Jason reached into his pocket, pulled out his personalized black and gold business card, and slid it onto the counter. The embossed letters gleamed under the dim restaurant lights. The silence was deafening. Aaliyah's eyes widened in pure shock. The other employees froze, staring at the card, then back at Jason. Even the customers started murmuring amongst themselves. Victor's smirk twitched, but he quickly covered it with a sneer. This some kind of prank? He picked up the card and flicked it with his fingers. You expect me to believe this? Jason tilted his head. You don't have to believe it, but you should believe them. Victor frowned. Then his confidence shattered as two large men in black suits stepped forward. Jason's personal security. They had been dining in the restaurant the whole time, blending in. Now they moved with purpose, positioning themselves behind Victor. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered black man with a stone-cold stare, crossed his arms. Mr. Statham isn't playing, he said, voice deep and unwavering. Victor's throat bobbed. He looked between the men, then at Jason, then back at the business card in his hand. The reality hit him like a freight train. Jason Statham owned this restaurant. Jason watched as Victor's confidence cracked, then crumbled. You? Victor's voice was quieter now. You're really the owner? Jason nodded slowly. And I've been watching how you run things here, his gaze darkened. I don't like what I see. Aaliyah's breath hitched. The other employees exchanged cautious glances, as if daring to hope. Victor's lips parted, his mind scrambling for a way out. Listen, I was just... Bam! The double doors to the restaurant swung open, and suddenly a group of sharply dressed men entered. Jason's jaw tightened. He recognized them immediately. They weren't just some businessmen. These were the men who funded Jason's high-end restaurant chain, the people who had influence over the future of his business. And when Jason saw the cold, knowing smirks on their faces, he knew something was wrong. Victor's shoulders straightened. The fear in his eyes flickered, then vanished completely. Jason narrowed his gaze. What's this? The tallest of the investors, a gray-haired man in an expensive suit, smiled. We heard about an incident at this location. His tone was smooth, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Jason glanced at Aaliyah, then back at them. You mean Victor firing a hard-working employee for no reason? Yeah, I handled it. Another investor, A slim man with sharp features stepped forward. Actually, Mr. Statham, you don't have the authority to do that. The air shifted. Jason's eyes darkened. What are you talking about? The gray-haired man exhaled, feigning disappointment. You may have founded this restaurant, but let's not forget who made it successful. He gestured to the other investors. We control the funding, the partnerships, the reputation. His lips curled. And we don't take kindly to sudden changes in leadership. Victor's smirk was back, stronger than before. Jason clenched his jaw. This isn't a leadership change. This is accountability. Victor is a liability to this business. The investors exchanged amused looks. Then the sharp-featured one stepped closer, voice dropping. Jason, let's be honest. He leaned in slightly. This isn't about business. Jason stilled. The investor's smirk widened. This is about control. Jason's fingers twitched. Excuse me? The gray-haired man sighed, as if speaking to a child. We like Victor because he keeps things selective. He gave a knowing glance at the restaurant staff, at Aaliyah, at the few black customers dining. This place wasn't meant to be inclusive. Jason's blood ran cold. You're making a mistake, Jason said, voice controlled but sharp. The investor chuckled. No, Jason, you did. You thought you still had full control. But we've been watching you. The people you hire, the changes you make. Let me be clear. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. We don't want those kinds of people working here. And if you have a problem with that, he smiled. You're the one who will be leaving. Silence. Jason's jaw clenched. This wasn't just about Victor anymore. This was bigger. These men had been silently backing Victor, protecting him, encouraging him. Jason's security tensed behind him. Aaliyah looked between them, confusion turning to fear. Jason took a slow breath. He wasn't just fighting Victor. He was fighting the entire system. And for the first time, he realized he might lose. The air in the restaurant was thick with tension. Jason stood still, his jaw clenched, eyes locked on the investors and Victor. The weight of what they had just said settled like a stone in his chest. We don't want those kinds of people working here, man. Jason's fingers curled into fists. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. The restaurant was full. Customers whispered. Employees stood frozen. Aaliyah looked at Jason, fear and hopelessness in her eyes. Jason inhaled deeply. Then he flipped the script. Click. A small green light blinked on his phone. He had been recording everything. Victor's arrogance, the investors' racist remarks, their open admission to discrimination. It was all on tape. Jason raised the phone, turning it toward the staff and customers. His voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. Did you all hear that? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Customers who had been trying to ignore the drama now turned their attention fully to Jason. Jason played the recording aloud, amplifying their words for everyone to hear. We don't want those kinds of people working here. A hush fell over the restaurant. Then, outrage, yeas, gasps, murmurs. A man at a nearby table slammed his glass down. Did they really just say that? A woman clutched her purse. Unbelievable! One of the staff members, a young Latino chef, stepped forward, his hands trembling with anger. So that's why we've been treated like trash? More employees joined in. A black hostess removed her apron. I knew something was off with the way they hired people. Victor's smirk vanished. His face paled as the weight of the moment hit him. This is out of context. He turned to Jason. You can't just record private conversations. Jason raised an eyebrow. Private? You said it loud and clear in front of everyone. Victor's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Jason took it further. He tapped his phone and went live. The camera streamed directly to his massive social media following. To anyone watching, Jason said, this is Victor, a manager who abuses his employees. And these are the investors who back him up. He turned the camera toward the group of suited men. They just admitted to enforcing discrimination in my restaurant. The chat exploded instantly. What? This is disgusting! Boycott this place now! Expose them all! Victor lunged forward, trying to swipe the phone. Turn that off! Jason sidestepped him effortlessly. A deep voice rang out from behind. No one touches Mr. Statham. Jason's security stepped forward, blocking Victor with an unmovable wall of muscle. The investors immediately tried to backtrack. Now, Jason, let's not be hasty, the gray-haired investor said, forcing a tight-lipped smile. We're willing to, Jason cut him off. Save it. You're done. With one swift motion, he pulled out a folder from his jacket. He tossed it onto the counter. The investors stared. Legal documents. I've been planning this for a while, Jason said. You thought I wouldn't notice how you run things. I did, and I've had my lawyers working behind the scenes. His gaze hardened. I'm buying out your shares, effective immediately. The restaurant erupted. Gasps, cheers. The employees exploded into applause. The investors panicked. You can't just... Jason smirked. Oh, but I can, and I did. He pointed to the cameras around the restaurant. And now, everyone will know exactly what you stood for. Victor looked around, sweat dripping down his forehead. Wait! He turned desperately to Jason. I was just following their orders, Victor pleaded. I didn't mean any harm. I was just doing what they wanted. Jason stared at him, disgust flickering across his face. You humiliated people. You tormented Aaliyah. You made this place toxic. Victor fell to his knees. Please, Jason, give me another chance. Jason didn't even blink. Get out. The security guards grabbed Victor by the arms. He screamed, thrashing. Jason, please, I'll change. But the doors slammed shut behind him. The entire restaurant erupted into applause. Aaliyah covered her mouth, eyes glistening with tears. Thank you, she whispered. Jason turned to the employees. This restaurant will be different now. No more fear, no more hate, the staff cheered. Outside, Victor stumbled onto the pavement, humiliated. Reporters were already gathering, flashing cameras in his face. His downfall was public, immediate, permanent. And inside, Jason had won. The restaurant buzzed with energy. Employees smiled, exchanging relieved glances. The heavy weight that had loomed over them for so long finally lifted. Customers clapped, some recording on their phones, knowing they had just witnessed something historic. But in the midst of all the celebration, Aaliyah stood frozen. She had won. She got her job back. The toxic manager was gone. The investors were out. But the scars remained. Jason noticed the way she hugged herself, her fingers gripping the fabric of her uniform. Her eyes flickered with doubt. He stepped forward, his voice softer than before. Aaliyah, she snapped out of her thoughts, blinking up at him. Yes? You okay? Aaliyah hesitated, then exhaled deeply. I should be, right? I got my job back. Justice was served. But, she swallowed hard. I keep thinking about what Victor said, how he treated me, how no one stood up before today. What if... Her voice faltered. What if the next person in charge is just like him? Jason's jaw tensed. He understood. Racism, abuse of power, it didn't just disappear overnight. He leaned in slightly, voice steady. Let me tell you something. The world is full of victors. You'll meet people like him again. People who think they can walk all over you, make you feel small. Aaliyah lowered her gaze. Jason gently lifted her chin so she'd look at him. Never let them silence you again. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she nodded. Jason gave her a small smile. You're stronger than you think. Aaliyah let out a shaky laugh. Guess I have a pretty cool mentor now, huh? Jason smirked. Damn right. The weight on her shoulders lifted just a little. The night air was crisp. Jason stepped out, hands in his pockets, taking in the cool breeze. The street was mostly empty, except for a few lingering customers chatting about what had just gone down. But then something felt off. Jason's instincts kicked in. He wasn't alone. Slowly, he scanned the area. Across the street, under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, a man stood watching. Dark suit, hands clasped behind his back, face hidden in the shadows. Jason's eyes narrowed. The man didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. A slow realization settled in Jason's gut. This wasn't just a random bystander. This was someone connected to Victor. Maybe even his real boss. Jason clenched his jaw. So this wasn't over. Not even close. The man took a step back into the darkness and disappeared. Jason exhaled sharply. Game on.